Everyone says there won't be a war in Taiwan because the consequences would be terrible. The open world would collapse, globalization would end. Yes, all of this seems logical, and logically there should be no war. But it is precisely such reasoning that prevented us from noticing the approach of other conflicts in the very recent past. Therefore, yes, the consequences will be severe. We have never seen such wars in the 21st century, but it is possible and quite likely that China will move its armed forces to Taiwan. The US might intervene, and from my perspective, there is the potential for a global nuclear war. Such forecasts are already being made, scenarios are being constructed. Let's try to construct a scenario of such a conflict. Year.
The reunification of the motherland is a historical inevitability.
I now want to talk to you about what I want to do. Here is a New Year's wish from the chairman of the PRC, Xi Jinping. Of course, it's better to do it peacefully, but as the chairman said, we will never renounce the use of force. President Biden has already made it clear that in such a case, America will not limit itself to supplying weapons as it did with Ukraine. America will fight. Let's clarify right away that both Russia and the United States recognize Taiwan as part of Greater China. They just understand it a little differently. But in fact, Beijing does not exercise operational control over Taiwan. For them, it is a rebellious province. How did it come to this? In 1945, China was ruled by the Kuomintang Party, the nationalist party led by General Chiang Kai-shek. Communists controlled territory under Mao Zedong. The United States supported Chiang Kai-shek while Stalin supported Mao Zedong. In 1946, a civil war began in the country. Chiang Kai-shek was a peculiar man. He could have crushed the communists as early as 1946. Instead, he gave them a respite, and Stalin established supplies of captured Japanese weaponry to Mao. Moreover, Chiang Kai-shek did not take into account that his entire army and his close circle were infiltrated by red agents. As a result, his 1.5 million strong army suffered a terrible military defeat. Chiang Kai-shek departed to Taiwan, taking with him about 1 million people, the entire gold reserve, and a mountain of cultural treasures. American ships stood in the strait protecting him. And since then, Taiwan has been living more or less its own separate life. Until his death, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek dreamed of returning to Greater China and restoring his power there. Of course, nothing of the sort happened. But back then, the balance of power was different. Today, everything is different. China has strengthened over the years of reform. It has an overwhelming military advantage. An army of 2 million against 200,000 in Taiwan. Tanks, 5,000 against 1,000. Aircraft, 1,200 against 300. Ships, 730 against 110. But it's terrible. An inconvenient island for an assault. Rocks to the east, swamps to the west, and then there's the Taiwan Strait, 200 kilometers. How to deal with this? Let's discuss this with an expert. Today, it's international relations specialist Vasily Kaishi and military analyst Artem Maltsev.
In fact, there are about 14 beaches suitable for direct landing, with a total length of approximately 70 kilometers. In the central part of the island, the beach consists of silty bottom deposits, and these beaches are very unsuitable for landing any armored vehicles. I would say that 100,000. This is somewhat the upper limit that can land in the first week of the operation. Moving to the Taiwanese side, in the event of a threat or the start of a major military conflict, Taiwan plans to mobilize reservists. Approximately, in the first week of the conflict, approximately 150,000 military personnel. In the case of an optimistic scenario, 150 against 100 attackers is a good ratio. Exactly. And indeed, from the perspective of any offensive operation, it is considered that for the success of an offensive operation, the attacking side needs superiority compared to the defender of approximately 3 to 1. Since Taiwan is an island, then during an amphibious operation, the Chinese ground forces of the Marine Corps will be forced to operate mainly with light units, while on the Taiwanese side, it is clear that they have access to full heavy armored units.
There hasn't been an amphibious assault of this scale since the Normandy landings, and the Chinese army lacks combat experience. The last war was in 1979 with Vietnam. Not very successful. So this time, Beijing will likely try to first strike the island with missiles and destroy everything capable of resisting.
China possesses a very significant superiority over both Taiwan and the US armed forces in the Western Pacific. It has a gigantic arsenal of long-range weapons, cruise and ballistic missiles. Taiwan is 36,000 square kilometers. That is, it's a small territory on which enormous forces will be deployed. Probably an order of magnitude more than what Russia is using in Ukraine. And probably in an optimal turn of events, China would try to quickly, with missile strikes, destroy Taiwan's air defense, destroy, disable the main bases. But again, the experience of Ukraine suggests that the chances of a quick resolution are slim.
Taiwan has a fairly powerful air force with up to 300 modern combat aircraft. But these aircraft are located on approximately 15 to 30 air bases and airfields. And in principle, China has all the capabilities to cover these airfields with a single strike, a massive concentrated strike. There is no doubt that in the first weeks of the conflict, the Taiwanese fleet will be completely neutralized. Because again, ships in modern surface warfare are extremely vulnerable. There is some chance that Taiwan will move part of its ships to the east coast. And there they might survive, hiding from Chinese attacks a little longer.
It is possible that, in response, Taiwan will launch missiles at Beijing and Shanghai. It probably has several hundred of such missiles. Modern metropolises have become symbols of Chinese modernization. And now imagine those skyscrapers on fire. It would be a terrifying end to an entire era.
This work has been ongoing since the 2000s. Taiwan is armed with several types of medium-range cruise missiles, the first of which were designed to target Shanghai. Now, according to their statements, they can reach Beijing as well. Well, it seems that some isolated strikes will be carried out, but at the same time, the Chinese, of course, understand this perfectly well. Around major cities, there is a powerful layered air defense system, meaning probably all this is indeed already being factored into the planning, although hypothetically a missile could hit a Shanghai skyscraper at some point.
The most important thing is the battle will flare up in the sky over the Taiwan Strait.
Taiwan has a fairly developed air defense system, including at least 30 batteries of long-range surface-to-air missile systems, analogs of the American Patriots, and domestic S-300, S-400 systems. If the Chinese aviation wants to minimize its own losses and does not want to take risks, it will be forced to act somewhere around the middle, up to the median line.
Is that how it must fly around?
Yes, up to the median line of the strait. And in fact, direct action over the coast is critically necessary for China to support the landing operation. It is impossible to land on a beach under direct artillery fire. And one of the commonly accepted methods of combating and suppressing artillery is precision airstrikes. Aviation must monitor the landing area, detect the firing positions of Taiwanese artillery, and effectively strike them in real time.
Taiwan has spent many decades preparing for a missile attack. Shelters and hangars have been carved into the rocks. If the People's Army Landing Force starts advancing through the shallows and is met with heavy fire, it could be disastrous for the attacking side.
If the air defense is not neutralized within the first hours of the conflict, which is actually very likely if the Taiwanese brigades leave their military bases and take up combat positions, then of course such a blitz campaign carries the risk of complete failure.
The Chinese People's Army will be able to fully deploy if it captures a port, and the security zone around it for the transfer of heavy equipment.
Let's assume that the Chinese army captures a large bridgehead on the territory of Taiwan with an area of about, let's say, 700,000 square kilometers. In that case, China can transfer virtually unlimited unit composition to the island. The Chinese ground forces are among the largest on the planet. We're talking about entire corps and armies.
Here, of course, there's a great temptation to land in the north. That's where the capital is, where the microchip factories are, a lightning-fast capture, and it's all over. But it's risky. Therefore, Beijing might choose a more conservative scenario. An attack from the south.
China will start with a landing operation not on Taiwan itself, but on smaller archipelagos and islands that are under control. Of Taipei, primarily, we're talking about the Penghu archipelago. And the group of Jinmen Islands. It will be very convenient to isolate this archipelago and turn it into a staging base, a sort of springboard for further landings north and south of the city of Kaohsiung. The main problem with the southern direction is the fact that Kaohsiung is in the south and the capital is in the north. The Chinese army will need to move north across the entire island. And that's almost 300 kilometers. An advance from the south to the north of the island could take months. It will most likely lead to widespread destruction across Taiwan and result in significant human losses.
A slow advance has obvious drawbacks. Taiwan will have time to mobilize, and the US could enter the war. Yes, America has a one-China policy, but it also has the Taiwan Relations Act, which, although not obligating, allows it to assist the island if Beijing decides to take it by force.
We assume that if the United States enters the conflict, they will engage there, almost certainly, together with Japan. Actions will likely begin with American aviation immediately from bases in Japan. That is, strikes will probably start likely against the Chinese fleet, against areas where Chinese aviation is based, against some control systems. And there will be strategic aviation action from the territory of the USA also delivering strikes against Chinese forces.
The USA cannot refrain from acting in the event of a hot war because then other allies. South Korea and Japan will think that America is an unreliable partner. This would be the end of the global dominance of the USA. China might launch a preemptive strike on American bases in Japan, the Philippines, and Guam. And this will be a major escalation. America will send a fleet to Taiwan, primarily submarines, to sink Chinese ships and disrupt the supply of the landing force.
Missile strikes by the American fleet and American aviation from great distances, hundreds of kilometers, far beyond this very map. They will, of course, most likely disrupt the landing operation because for a landing operation, China will need a huge number of ships. These ships will suffer heavy losses, even if the Chinese manage to shoot down some of these missiles. But still, most likely, the losses they will incur will not allow China to supply a large group on the main island of Taiwan. And in this case, the Chinese forces will find themselves isolated. They will be surrounded and without supplies, without fuel, without ammunition, without food. These forces will be forced to surrender and capitulate.
A year ago, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the USA simulated a landing of the Chinese army on Taiwan and ran the model dozens of times. In most cases, it turned out that the Taiwan-USA-Japan coalition repels the attack of the Chinese army, but only if they decisively engage in battle, regardless of the losses. And these losses are enormous. Dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of military personnel. The model showed that the USA would lose 2 aircraft carriers in this war. America's positions when around the world would be weakened for many years.
You've seen the example of the conflict in Ukraine, which is technically much simpler than what could happen around Taiwan. We know that in general. The forecasting capabilities of both sides turned out to be lacking. If the United States loses 2 aircraft carriers, well, it's actually hard to imagine how they could win the war. A prolonged war against China. Considering China's superiority, in production capacities and taking into account China's backing by Russia. A country that, of course, will not participate in the war, but will certainly continue to trade with China, supplying necessary raw materials. China now, as an industrial power, is larger than the US and Japan, combined as one. It can produce practically any products on a larger scale.
There is a theory that instead of landing troops on Taiwan, China might try to blockade the island from the sea. But this is very inconvenient to do because the rebellious province, besides the main island, also controls chains of islands that stretch to the very coast. For example, Kinmen, a very beautiful place, but likely this beauty will be swept away in the first minutes of an attack. Moreover, chains of islands approach Taiwan from different sides, belonging to other countries like the Philippines and Japan. China is not at all eager to invade their waters and violate their territorial integrity. And to bypass them, a huge detour would be necessary. And this whole situation with the islands, in principle, in their current state, forces China to think about how to eventually annex Taiwan and the surrounding islands.
A military operation around Taiwan will not resemble any other military conflicts that we have seen in the past. Such a large-scale naval air-sea operation in the history of humanity simply has not existed. There has been no war where the sides exchanged such a number of precision missile strikes. And predicting how these strikes will develop is quite difficult. China is deploying a massive program to build an amphibious fleet. The more amphibious ships there are, the more units China will be able to transfer to the island, and the better it will be able to ensure supply and logistics. The optimal window of opportunity has not yet arrived, and will probably come by the 2030s, maybe earlier. However, these military calculations do not take into account the ratios and layouts, political.
And why do we even assume that China will fight for Taiwan? It's about something else. It's about trade, about development. It has extensive modernization plans. It was about trade and development. And now it's about its role in history and greatness. The current chairman of the PRC, Xi Jinping, is very fond of Mao Zedong. On New Year's, he visited his mausoleum in Beijing, and before that, he took the party leadership to Mao's revolutionary headquarters in Yan'an. In 2027, there will be another Congress of the Communist Party of China. Can Xi Jinping step up to the podium and say, well, once again, we failed to reunite with Taiwan?
Admitting that nothing worked out is not an option, because there is a 2005 Chinese law on combating separatism, which states that if peaceful means for reunification are exhausted, it must be achieved by non-peaceful means. In other words, force must be applied. Do the Chinese have a specific deadline for resolving the issue? Strictly speaking, we don't know, but there have been statements indeed from Xi Jinping that indefinitely. This issue cannot be postponed.
Xi Jinping is a unique chairman. Never before after Mao Zedong has a country's leader gone for a third term. But Chairman Xi did. Never after Mao have the sayings of a chairman been studied. And now both communists and non-party members study Xi Jinping's quotes. Xi Jinping's predecessors, including Chairman Hu Jintao, tried not to use Mao's quotes. But remember the scene when the gray-haired Hu Jintao was taken by the arms and led out of the presidium at the party congress. A vivid symbol of how Xi Jinping bid farewell to the previous course.
A little red book that has accomplished many great deeds around the world. Selected works of Mao Zedong, 1 billion copies in different languages. The Red Chinese youth used it to hit revisionists and counter-revolutionaries on the head. To delve into Xi Jinping's thinking, let's turn to the primary source: war and peace. We are communists. Not only do we not oppose just wars, but we also actively participate in them. Some mock us, calling us proponents of the theory of the omnipotence of war. Yes, we are proponents of the theory of the omnipotence of revolutionary war. This is not bad, this is good, this is Marxist. We are for the eradication of war. We do not need war, but war can only be eradicated through war. If you want there to be no rifles, take up the rifle. And so, of course, Dare to struggle and dare to win is one of the favorite quotes of the Russian chairman. He used it quite often, including at the very Congress, where he was elected for a third term.
Always dare to struggle and dare to win.
The subtlety is that Mao uttered these words when his army was already being pressed by the troops. Chiang Kai-shek, the Red commanders were fleeing, and then Mao comes out. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Who to defeat? Of course, the nationalist troops who today have settled here in Taiwan. Therefore, when Xi Jinping recites these lines of Mao Zedong, they have a very special meaning. Xi Jinping is possibly the most powerful person on earth. No one in China can contradict him or divert him from his chosen course. He leads the Chinese Communist Party, which, according to the Constitution, governs all aspects of life in the country. In addition, he heads the Central Military Commission, which, according to the Constitution, directly commands the army. Xi Jinping will say, and the army will go to Taiwan. When dealing with such leaders, the most dangerous thing is not to listen to what they say, or to try to interpret. In reality, he meant something completely different, spoke metaphorically, and so on. None of that is necessary. This person has no one to deceive. What he meant, he expressed. And what has Xi Jinping said regarding war? And here it gets complicated. The fact is, there are several versions of the same speech he gave at the last Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. For example, the English official translation does not quite match the Chinese text. And the Chinese text is not exactly what Xi Jinping said from the podium. Therefore, if we take the written text as the canon, it turns out that Xi Jinping's speech is very militant and mobilizing. The words war and struggle appear frequently.
A truly remarkable person company that lived for 100 years.
The Chinese Communist Party has gone through a historical path of a century of struggle. The English translation of this phrase is excellent. The Chinese Communist Party. Since its founding 100 years ago, it has made a remarkable journey. This is not a journey. It is precisely a struggle. And so, throughout the text, every time the words struggle, battle, fight are replaced in the official English translation with efforts, aspirations, attempts, which fundamentally changes the entire character of the speech. But here is an excerpt from the same speech about military reform, which should have concerned many. Xi Jinping says, to decisively redirect the focus of all military work towards war preparation. In the English version, this passage is significantly softened. It says, focus the attention of all military personnel on combat readiness. In principle, all armies do this, nothing special. But this, especially in combination, with this, it means not just combat readiness, it is precisely preparation for war and conducting military operations. But the most remarkable thing is that these words of Xi Jinping were not heard by the Congress delegates. They only appeared in the written text of his speech, distributed later on as well as. Thus, observers who tried to read his report in English did not hear a threat in these words. But the party workers who studied Xi Jinping's speech at the Congress for their practical work understood correctly what their chairman meant. But in the end, these are just words. Where are the actions? Here's how things stand. China has doubled its military budget under Xi Jinping. China is building new bomb shelters in cities facing the Taiwan Strait. It is opening mobilization points across the country. A new law has been passed in China, making it easier to call up reservists during wartime. A new military hospital is being built. Reserves are being created in case of a blockade. Amphibious landings from the sea are being practiced more frequently in exercises. The United States is also preparing. The army is creating a blood donor bank. The Pentagon is launching the Replicator program. Thousands of drones will be handed over to artificial intelligence control to counter massive enemy attacks. And finally, America is increasing ammunition production. In 2 years, they will be producing 100,000 shells per month. In January of this year, Bloomberg published calculations on what would happen to the global economy if China landed troops on Taiwan and decided to blockade it by sea. The calculations are discouraging. The impact on the global economy would be devastating. High, 10%. Decrease in global GDP. And now the question is, why publish these calculations if everyone believes there won't be a war? If war breaks out, sea routes will be cut off and the supply of microchips will stop by a third. the global automotive industry and household appliance production will decline. Let's discuss this forecast with economist Anton Prokudin.
In our opinion, Bloomberg agency clearly overestimates the consequences of such a possible scenario too harshly. Moreover, what surprised us the most in the forecast is that China's GDP somehow decreases in one scenario and in another scenario by exports from China to the United States will likely cease, and this amount is approximately $550 billion, which is less than 3% of China's GDP, due to opposition.
The US recently threatened China with severe sanctions if it tries to annex Taiwan by force. But such sanctions are difficult to impose. China is too large.
This pressure on China will likely cause more problems for the United States because finished goods are usually produced for a specific market. And therefore, it will not be easy for the US to replace the missing goods, especially technologies, through other markets, such as Europe.
Based on Russia's experience, the sanction shock will last a year or two. Then the world will adapt. In the new configuration, China will become a regional hegemon. In such an outcome, war might even be beneficial for it.
The duration and effectiveness of the sanctions will quickly diminish. Naturally, in the first year of implementation, they will be most effective, most likely in the following years. There will hardly be any secondary additional effects from these sanctions. On the contrary, they will simply decrease and China will return to its growth trajectory. Whereas the United States, which has been growing at a rate of about 2% GDP, will continue to grow at this rate, maybe even slower, because they will lose dependent countries, for example, from Southeast Asia.
Can the global economy perhaps return to the state it was in before the conflict?
It will not return. That state will be something new. This era of cheap, especially electronics and consumer goods in general, will become a thing of the past. We no longer understand the value of things like smartphones, which we replace every 6 months. This was achieved because China followed the path of specializing entire regions in the production of specific types of goods. Not only will this cooperation collapse, but there will also be no possibility to quickly replicate it anywhere. Well, if we recall not only our country, but the whole world, Europe, somewhere in the 1960s, people didn't just go and buy, they specifically all saved up. Even not the poorest families, for some time to buy. A refrigerator was an event.
We hope that a complete break will not occur, or the world will play, so to speak, a game of tag, as happened with Russia, when supplies to Europe stop, but supplies to other regions continue. That is, there is simply a redistribution of logistical connections in the world. And new connections appear instead of the old ones, but overall, the world's GDP does not particularly suffer from such a redistribution of connections, and the economy continues to develop.
The previous abundance is likely not to return. An arms race will come anyway, even if the conflict is avoided. And military preparation will consume all the surpluses.
In the coming years, there will be a significant threat of conflict around Taiwan. It is real and it must be taken into account from a planning perspective. If this conflict occurs, we will find ourselves in an entirely new world where all the foundations of economic functioning will change and much more. If it can be avoided and there is just an arms race tension and a struggle for influence, in third countries, changes will occur, but more such inertial ones.
So, to summarize, universal human logic dictates that China should not send troops to Taiwan at all. Military logic suggests that such an invasion should be postponed for a year or two. But the Chinese leadership may have completely different plans. The fact is that the country's economy is slowing down. Third countries are preparing for this attack. And with each passing year, the situation for an invasion does not improve. Now is probably the most advantageous moment for an attack. But, Yibaye, an interesting window of opportunity will also be at the end of this year, when after the elections in America, if Biden loses, the new president has not yet taken office, and the old one is unlikely to decide to take active measures. So this island does not look like an island of stability at all. Rather, it is like a fuse leading to the powder keg of today. And yes, one more thing. Before it starts, subscribe to our YouTube channel and give us likes. We are also on Telegram. So see you on RTV.